Welcome to In Our Town, Conversations with Springfieldians Making a Difference. I'm your host, Tom Carlson, publisher of the Springfield Daily Citizen. If you'd like to comment on this episode, our email is inourtown@sgfcitizen.org. We'd love to hear from you. Everybody likes to talk about the future. And in Springfield, if we're going to have a bright future, we have to have good jobs. That means that we have to have a workforce and a location that businesses want to locate their businesses at. Another big issue is quality of schools. And if you make the cut by being able to put a check mark by those items, that doesn't mean that you're going to close the deal, which brings us to today's topic, developer incentives. Those are the giveaways that communities offer in order to attract businesses that are going to create jobs in a community. With us here today are Ben Jones, Director of Economic Development with City Utilities, and Amanda Ohlensehlen, Director of Economic Vitality for the City of Springfield. And they're going to tell us more about how that whole process works. Businesses that come here and decide to locate consider a lot of items in making that decision. They want to know that we have an educated workforce, that the location makes sense for their business, and the quality of schools are always a big issue. But even if you hit on all three of those and make the cut, that doesn't mean that you've sealed the deal. The next thing they'll come up with and ask is, well, so what kind of incentives are you folks here in Springfield willing to offer, because the folks down the road have got a pretty attractive package. With me to talk more about that today are Ben Jones, who works in economic development for City Utilities, and Amanda Ohlensehlen, who is the Director of Economic Vitality for the City of Springfield. Ben and Amanda, I'd like to welcome you to In Our Town.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ben, City Utilities doesn't get into issues like whether taxes should be reduced or not, but particularly if it's a manufacturing concern, a big item is whether the City Utilities is going to supply the power that they need to operate the business.
Correct.
So you'll get called in when a company's thinking of locating here, and they're going to ask you that question of what the City Utilities policies are. What are you going to say to them?
There's a couple different ways to approach that. A lot of it depends upon what type of company it is and what their utility load is going to be. We do enjoy excess generation capacity, meaning we are in a surplus in the sense that we can continue to accommodate growth. However, in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen the marketplace really shift from everybody having abundant power, and it was kind of a race to the lowest rate, who could supply power the cheapest, to now we're faced with a world where there is no longer a guaranteed abundance of electricity. Retirement of coal plants, the move away from fossil fuels to renewable fuels. Utilities are having to plan much more carefully. So in the big 30,000-foot sense, there is a question of, can we provide the power? But
so let me stop you right
Sure.
there. I kind of remember these discussions, and if a new business, a new manufacturing concern was coming to town, one of the selling points to people on city council was, well, they're going to be buying more electricity, and that means that the rates to the homeowners might not go up as quickly as they used to. But that's not the case anymore.
Well, that is still correct. However, what we're seeing today, thanks to the mobile phones and the computers we all carry, are tremendous demands for power. So to be clear, we can still accommodate growth. And for example, think of a Kraft Foods, Missouri State University. We could easily accommodate loads of that size again, 5, 10, 15 megawatts. That's right in our wheelhouse, and I'm trying not to sound too technical here.
Well, let's talk about that, because I think a lot of people get confused about a megawatt and a kilowatt.
Sure.
Bring that down to my level.
Sure.
A megawatt would supply how many homes, for example?
Rather than do that, let me put this example out there. Some of our large manufacturers, think of a large food manufacturer. We have several, and I don't want to call exactly one of them out because some of these are very guarded trade secrets. But a good-sized food manufacturer, we have several. We have Highland Dairy, we have Dairy Farmers, we have Kraft Foods, we have French's. A big manufacturing facility like that could use anywhere from 6 to 10 megawatts, let's say.
Per month or day or what?
Well, that's the demand. That's kind of like the flow of water, let's say. That's the rate at which they're consuming electricity.
I see. Okay. All
That's
right.
a measure called demand. So That's a pretty good size industrial load on our system, and we would love to accommodate more of those. As a matter of fact, we've competed for some food manufacturers here over the last year and a half, and we're still hoping that we land a few more just like that. But to my earlier point, what we're seeing now are data centers and facilities that now are requiring 50, 100, 200 megawatts of power. To give you an example, City Utilities has supplied at a peak here in Springfield. I think our peak was 800 megawatts, might be just shy of that. And again, I'm going by memory here. But imagine one facility using almost as much power as Springfield is using today.
Well, and to your point, times are changing. I read somewhere about like Bitcoin and mining for Bitcoin,
Sure.
that 1 or 2% of the power consumed in the United States is used just by those computers.
Correct.
And with the advent of artificial intelligence, that's just going to go nowhere but up.
Correct. And our commitment is to our customers. We have to keep the lights on for everybody. It's not just for your home, but also for the place you work, for our hospitals, for our schools. So we work very closely with our engineers and planning staff when we're thinking of how do we work with and attract new load for our system. And remember, that's not just for electricity, but also for water and gas. So we're always thinking about how do we work, how do we look at, and how do we ensure that when we're adding new load to our system, that it's in the best long-term interest of everybody on our system. It's called load factor, and we're always working to make sure that we have a good load factor because you are correct. Our assets are built to be used. If they're sitting there idle, if we're not using the power from the power plant or the power that we buy from Southwest Power Pool on the big grid, that's not the best use of that system. So we're always looking to grow our system, but we're trying to grow it in a very smart way.
Amanda, you don't deal with that aspect of it. Instead, when a new company's coming to town, they're going to build a plant, what kind of questions are they going to ask you about in terms of incentives?
Right. So I think, from a bigger picture, companies, they want to know that there are utilities readily available. So certainly we try to market our geographic location is very attractive. So, taking a step back is, first of all, can we provide their needs, which really are utilities, workforce, sites, etc. So
schools are a big issue, aren't they?
Schools, correct. So all of those factors play into whether we're in consideration for a particular project. But certainly if they identify Springfield as an option, one of those next questions are what incentives are available. Many companies may be looking at multiple states, and each state differs as far as what is allowable for incentives, often set forth in state law. So much of Missouri's options really surround that topic of tax abatement that you mentioned before. So there are several different programs that may be available to help abate either real property taxes or taxes that may be on certain equipment and things like that. So,
well, let me stop you there for a second. I think we've seen a lot of this, for example, in the Kansas City area. Some business is deciding whether to locate on the Missouri line or on the Kansas line, but at the end of the day, it's really just one big metropolitan area. And so it's, in a sense, kind of a race to the bottom, isn't it? Whether you get it or I get it if I live in Kansas. And, well, I hear people say, hey, wait a minute. I've been here in Springfield for 30 years. I'm not getting a tax break. And you're letting somebody come in that's going to compete with me and get a tax break that I can't get. Doesn't seem like you care a lot about the people who are already here. How do you answer that question?
Absolutely. And I think, that is a really great point. Our best opportunity is to see expansion of the businesses and companies that are already here in Springfield. So if there is an addition that a manufacturing plant may be making, we want them to consider Springfield first before, we look at competition with other states. So while oftentimes there's a lot of publicity and attention for new projects that are coming to town, we really try to focus on helping our existing businesses and sectors expand, as well as attracting companies that can help our existing companies. If there's a certain sector within a supply chain, are there companies that can co-locate together that would make a lot of sense, particularly for Springfield and through our new comprehensive plan forward SGF. There are a lot of guidelines and goals set for the types of projects that we want to attract and incentivize. So, that kind of comes down to programs that are geared toward job creation, investment, what is their investment level? What are the types of jobs that will be offered? Because ultimately, we want to help improve the quality of life for all of our citizens. We need to be able to attract people to live and work here.
Okay, but let me again pause, and I'm just playing the devil's advocate, but these questions get asked.
Sure.
So is there a community consensus about we want this kind of business, but not that kind of business? I know there's discussion with it, and over the years, for example, the Chamber of Commerce has certainly taken a position on that sort of thing. Do we sort of cherry pick or go after a particular kind of business, or do we say as long as they're going to play by the same rules as everybody else, the gate's open?
Absolutely. I mean, from that standpoint, we don't necessarily have control over which types of companies and what type of sector they may work in. But we do work very closely with our partners at the state, the Department of Economic Development and Missouri Partnership. Sometimes those requests for information come through the state, and it really is trying to target those industries and those jobs that are going to provide quality wages. And how Springfield can be attractive is to have the availability of workforce. So we, within our Department of Economic Vitality, we work closely with our Workforce Development Department to ensure that we have the types of training programs, apprenticeships, et cetera, that make our region competitive compared to, maybe another city or another state.
And a couple analogies. I've been doing this for a while. So the analogy of comparing Springfield to Kansas City and St. Louis, where they're literally competing with the state line, splitting their metro area right down the middle. Springfield's a little different in one sense. There you have two state governments literally racing to the bottom, as you said. And I believe there was some legislation passed a few years ago to end what we call the border war in Kansas City, because you're right, it does not make sense for incentives to lure a company 5 miles in one direction because their employee base is staying the same. Both people from Kansas and Missouri are working there. So you're correct, that doesn't make sense. A better analogy here is Springfield, say, versus Joplin. Now, not to beat up on my friends in Joplin, but that's a real competitive situation. And we do work and think about what types of companies we want to see here. Now, remember, we don't have hundreds of inquiries every day. Usually it's a pretty sizable manufacturing concern or a distribution concern that's looking here. And companies that are growing and expanding typically are paying well above the average county wage. So we really don't get a lot of inquiries from somebody that shows up and says, hey, I'm trying to pay the absolute minimum I can. If they did, I think their answer would probably be, well, there's a piece of property, you're more than welcome to buy it. We can't stop you, but we probably don't have anything to offer.
Okay.
So a lot of state and local incentives are based upon paying at or above average county wage. And then also there's the but-for clause. But for this incentive, this project wouldn't happen. And that's true for both existing businesses and new businesses. And the truthism in economic development is 80 to 90% of all the projects we announce are with companies that are already here. Kraft Foods, 3M, McCormick Purchasing, French's. A lot of the projects that we're working on are already here, and they have the same access to those types of incentives we're discussing as anybody else. Now, another example is Buc-ee's. That's another project that we just landed, in 2021? Had to compete to get them here. And to your point that you made earlier before we started recording, they literally said, we're looking at this site, but there's a couple just up and down the road. So we had to work hard to make sure that those retail sales tax dollars were landing here in Springfield. So in a lot of cases, it's less of a giving dollars away. It's more of a deferring dollars or steering them to improving the infrastructure on the project.
The rules used to be, when I was involved in this, we talk about real estate tax abatement. And so you would have a piece of real estate that's generating $5,000 in real estate taxes. But if they put in a $20 million commercial facility, now it's generating $200,000 or some number like that. And the argument that was advanced was, well, we want them to come to town, We think if we don't give them this tax break, they may not. But it's not going to hurt the schools and the county because we're going to require that they will at least continue to pay what we're already getting. And right now, all we're doing is growing weeds out there.
Correct.
And then it seemed like for the rules that I remember, there was like 15 years at 100% abatement and then 50% at 10. Is that generally the rule now, or has it changed?
I mean, there are several different programs
Yeah.
for real property tax abatement. And yes, there's a set term, but as those companies or projects apply for incentives, as Ben mentioned, there's a but-for test. There's analysis of that pro forma. So just because the program would allow 100% tax abatement for a certain period of time doesn't necessarily mean that the project will receive it if it doesn't warrant it. So it's an individual analysis of each project. So there's kind of a maximum, but it varies depending on what the project outcomes are going to be.
For our listeners, the way I understand that but-for test, it says, but for us giving them this incentive, the deal wouldn't get done. And so if they need a $20,000 break in order to make their revenues come in line with their expenses, we'll give them that, but we're not going to give them 50.
Right. Correct.
Just enough to make the deal work.
Correct.
But, well, I'll just mention craft, for example. I can tell you, this all sounds great when you're in graduate school and reading the books, and you say, well, we're not going to give them this break, but for they need it. But there's a little bit, at least from the perspective I had when I was in local politics, there's an element of what I'll call bluff poker. Let's take a business like Kraft. It's got some of the best jobs here in Springfield. And they say, well, we're going to put in $100 million worth of new equipment if you give us a break on the personal property taxes that we would pay on that. And the question that goes through your mind is, well, if I didn't give you the break, would you still do the deal? And more often than not, they would say, probably not. And so here's what you are faced with if you're up there having to vote yes or no.
Right.
Do I go ahead and give them the break and know that there's a lot of good jobs that will stay here in our community?
Mm-hmm.
Or do I say, you know what, you guys have been here for 50 years. I don't think you're going to pull up stakes and not do it. But what if I'm wrong? And so the safe thing is to fold your hand.
Let me give you a little background on that Kraft Foods.
Well,
because
I know it's the least, but that's happened a couple times before you were here.
Yeah. And you're right. There's no way you can know for sure. It is, at the end of the day, sometimes you are trying to make a judgment call with the best information you have onto whether or not they're telling you the truth. But sometimes you can look around and gather some intelligence yourself. When Kraft Foods approached the city of Springfield and us, they wanted two things. They mentioned utility rates, which we had our Rider D, which we were able to help accommodate them to help lower their cost of utilities for a slight period of time as they were growing. And then they also looked for help with financing costs, meaning the Chapter 100 bond incentive, which includes property tax abatement. But more importantly for them, they were looking for a way to reduce the sales tax expense on all the new equipment they were going to buy. And they did, I believe, $200 or $300 million of improvements to the facility here in Springfield. But they very specifically mentioned, there's other Kraft food facilities out there, and they specifically mentioned Champaign, Illinois, and New Ulm, Minnesota, which is kind of southwest of Minneapolis. And if you go on Google Maps and just type in Kraft Foods, Champaign, Illinois, you will see a building that is almost identical to the one we have here. It's a big rectangle with tubes and piping and stuff on top of it. And if you go to New Ulm, you can see a very similar building. Now, I wasn't so worried about New Ulm because it's a little landlocked. Sometimes you can learn a little bit about your competition. But the one in Champaign, Illinois has a lot of property around it. So I knew that their threat of, not really a threat, but I knew that they had the option of saying, you know what, we could do this expansion of one of several places in the Kraft food system. And I also knew, and I say in my I shouldn't be doing that. I was part of an economic development team that helped work this project along. One of the things we knew is that the facility here in Springfield was quite old. And some of the products they were making had been around for a while, and some of the equipment was quite old, and they were wanting to modernize the plant. And we realized, and like you mentioned, you were on the council, the choice was, do we help this company out and help them modernize and guarantee that the people that are working there today are still working there or not? So you're right, we did take the chance, and I'll tell you when it really paid off is the day that Kraft Heinz merged. On the day of the merger, and I've forgotten the gentleman's name, but the new CEO, guess which facility in the new Kraft Heinz system, because he came from Heinz. They visited Springfield, Missouri first. They came to the facility that had some of the newest equipment and that was growing quickly and had received support from the local community. So I was very proud to take part of that, and I think it's a real win for the city of Springfield, and that's a great example of showing a good way to use incentives to help ensure that the project locates here. And I just, prior to this interview, I went and looked at the latest Google Earth picture of Champaign, Illinois. It's still there, but they've added a building on the side, and it's surrounded by trucks. And I believe they've turned it into a distribution center, which that's good, still jobs, but it's not a manufacturing facility anymore, I don't think.
Let me ask you, Ben, I would have voted the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, how much money did we leave on the table by giving that incentive? Do you know?
I don't. For city utilities, it's not leaving money on the table. We did leave in the sense that we didn't give it up. It was new electric load growth for us. So basically, we settled for a slightly less amount of income for new electricity that we were selling. We did not go back and say, your existing bill is now less. So just like the property tax abatements, we start with where we're at. And then for the new additional load, we gave them a bit of a discount. Our discount only lasts 5 years on our Rider D, and it slides down. It starts at a 25% discount on just one portion of the charge. It's about a 7% discount. So all of the Rider Ds that we did for them, they've already passed. They are paying the same rate as any other industrial customer here in Springfield.
Okay. We'll be right back after this short break.
Hello, everyone. I'm Shannon Kay, and I'm the visual journalist at the Springfield Daily Citizen. I started out working overnights at KTTS. I did do my internship at KSMU. After that, I traveled on down to Branson. I very quickly became the news director down there. Afterward, I started working for Carbon Trace Productions, and there I was the executive director. I really see being a journalist in general as being a public service. My days, they are both regimented and not at all. Doing like my day-to-day task, which includes like the calendar and the obits, from touring along with one of the reporters to working on a Photoshop project so that way we can really make our product here at Springfield Daily Citizen shine. One of my favorite things about living in Springfield is that you never know who you are going to meet. We are one of those like big, small towns, and so you can meet these people that are internationally famous and you find out that they live in Springfield.
So, Amanda, let me give you a hypothetical.
Okay.
There's an intersection along, let's say, Highway 65, and a developer comes to town and says, I want to build a $100 million development here, but I want the city to put in the streets and the lights and the sewer, or if you're not willing to do that, at a minimum, I want to be able to increase the sales tax for all those retail businesses here. And if you do that, it's going to increase the number of sales tax coming into the city. So that sounds pretty good. But then you have those businesses at Battlefield Mall and saying, well, why are you subsidizing that guy's shoe store out there and not mine? How do you work through that and decide whether you should give those incentives or not?
That's a challenge that we face all the time in this work. Certainly, kind of what you referenced, increment financing would probably be a good tool, which helps fund public improvements such as, the transportation improvements or the utility extensions to a new development. And basically, the city doesn't pay anything up front, but the performance of that particular development through redirection of those sales and use taxes can help fund those or reimburse those improvements over time. So that's a model that the city of Springfield has used pretty successfully. Certainly through that work, we hope to attract and diversify the types of retailers in particular that we have within Springfield. We are an activity hub for the entire region, and not everyone may realize that the city relies very heavily on sales and use taxes to fund our general fund, which, funds public safety and public works and, all of the activities and services of the city. So we are very reliant on retail sales to drive the success of our city. So being able to attract quality retailers and new developments is important, while also at the same time, we want to encourage redevelopment within our key corridors as well.
But you're going to have some difficulty with an existing business growing if you're subsidizing a competitor that's coming in here.
Yeah, it's competition, and I mean, the market is full of that. You mentioned Battlefield Mall performs very well, especially for that. They have a very high occupancy, very little vacancy. Some of their retailers set records as far as sales volume and the amount of visitors. So, Springfield is attractive to many different kinds of retailers. Our hope is that a new development doesn't drive out another one, but perhaps attracting shoppers or visitors from an area that maybe wouldn't travel across town to the same goods or services. So oftentimes kind of proximity to other similar things can help that.
What's the checklist for you to decide whether to give the incentives or not then?
Well, I might be able to help with this one a little bit. So you kind of mentioned Battlefield Mall. So we have local developers here that build large-scale shopping centers.
Right.
Not a Battlefield Mall thing, but when those are usually coming through pre-devs, a lot of times we don't know exactly who or what's going to be filling those. All we know is that we're going to get a large retail area, say with 30,000 square feet of shopping space, and this particular building is going to be subdivided into 4 spaces. Could be restaurants, could be a retail store. We don't really know. But the choice facing the city and facing the utility company is, here's an area that's, as you mentioned earlier, a greenfield that's generating really relatively no tax revenue. You're right. I mentioned the success at Kraft Foods. That's competing with other manufacturers for workforce. So no matter what we do as we grow the economy, somewhere, somehow, we're probably increasing competition for somebody. But to go back to the retail development, when we're looking at it at the very initial planning stages, we're thinking, well, if shoppers are willing to pay another half-cent sales tax, let's say, on their sales tax to shop here, we can have a new area that brings possibly new stores to the area or possibly additional stores. Depending upon where it's located in the city, we may be drawing shoppers in from the southeast part of the area or the southwest part of the area. And I think we have to kind of look at it holistically and say, we can have a project here that returns sales tax. And yes, it may be increasing competition for some of our existing businesses, but we have a developer that has a project and probably has already been speaking with customers that may fill that space. So I think sometimes looking at it in that way, it's not going to make that person who owns the store that they now have a new competitor in town feel any better. But I don't know that there's too many folks here in town that don't enjoy competition already. And sometimes having more shopping choices in the area can bring even more folks into the greater area as a whole.
Well, it sounds like, and maybe this isn't the case, but it sounds like maybe the policies have changed a little bit. Seems like the thought process that used to apply in this was, if you're going to have a Costco come to town when there isn't a Costco, and it brings something unique to the community, because at the end of the day, that's going to grow more sales tax. But if it's something that we already have, we were less inclined to give them a break, because we felt like if it's a service and so forth that we already have, they should have to compete on the same level. But it sounds like that thought process has changed in recent years.
Not necessarily. Oftentimes, kind of recent examples are a new retailer that is coming to town, such as a Costco's or a Buc-ee's, and they're wanting to locate a store in an area that doesn't have those public improvements that can support a major big box retailer. So that often is the case of an extension of, utilities and public improvements that then can help attract and and help support some of the smaller businesses that will kind of be able to co-locate around there. So it's usually, an anchor tenant, and we are doing a significant amount of analysis and research and really studying those financials to make the best recommendation that we can to City Council for consideration. We want it to be a project that is defensible to the public for council, so that it is improving the city, adding new revenues that otherwise can look at things that we don't have in Springfield, where Springfield residents go to other locations and shop. So being able to have some diversity of retailers is very important. But then oftentimes it does end up impacting and helping those smaller businesses because they may be able to locate where there are now utilities available because they couldn't bear the burden of that cost themselves.
So let's talk about blight for a minute. We're going to run out of time, and I think it's something. There are lots of other things to talk about as well, but we can't do that in one podcast. But it used to be that in order to grant tax abatement, real estate tax abatement, the city would have to make a determination that an area was blighted. And we did a heck of a lot of that in the downtown area. And the argument for doing it was we've already got millions and millions of dollars invested in infrastructure in the downtown area, and we don't want to create a donut effect by letting that continue to deteriorate. So we would make a finding that the area is blighted, and then that made it possible for a developer to come in and to get the real estate tax abatement we talked about previously, continue to get the same amount of revenue from the property, but on the improvements for the next several years, it would be less. But the idea was, at the end of the day, that it was a good way to preserve our infrastructure. And the rule was, if it essentially was, unless it was a brownfield site or something like that, it was confined to essentially the center city area or Commercial Street, that kind of thing. But my sense is, and maybe I'm wrong, the notion of blighting other areas is now being applied in what arguably is not a blighted area. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so there are several programs that are authorized under the revised Missouri statutes that do require a finding of blight that would allow for property tax abatement for a period of time. That blight determination is defined in Missouri law, so there are certain things that must be there to demonstrate that predominance of blight that you mentioned. So it certainly is at times a touchy subject as far as whether there is blight present. There are larger redevelopment areas where a predominance of blight is kind of shown over multiple parcels in a larger geographic region than just perhaps blighting one individual property. So, that oftentimes is where there could be some conflict or friction and maybe what you're referencing.
Well, we used to just essentially say, unless it was something, for example, on Bass Pro, when Zenith moved out of there, frankly, the community did backflips to get Bass Pro to stay in Springfield and not go elsewhere and to take over a gigantic empty building. And it's been a win-win. I think we would all agree on that,
Yeah.
Candidly, now I'll be a lawmaker. I think if they would have just changed the phrase, the example you mentioned of an abandoned industrial building, that's obviously blight. A downtown area that has lapsed into disrepair, no matter where that is, that's blight. Everybody gets that. I think the rub is when people look at a beautiful green field and say, how is that blight? Well, it's really not. They should have called that underutilized or something else in the law and then made it eligible for the incentives that it takes to develop that piece of property.
It is an unfortunate word.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate word choice. So unfortunately, when you say the word blight, people picture something, run down, the roof or the porch is falling in, and you're right, that is blighted. But how do you transfer that over to a green field that you're going to develop and build something new that's going to be a real asset to the area? So unfortunately, our folks in Jefferson City called that blight. They really should have called it underutilization or something different. And I think that would have helped clear up a lot of the misconceptions that are out there.
Yeah, and the definition of blight has changed in recent years. And so it used to be that some of the different programs actually had a different definition of blight, but now that's more unified. So you're really looking at some key factors to demonstrate that there is blight present. So it really is kind of a technical analysis, but the word choice, the verbiage, sometimes elicits a different idea in people's minds.
One of the things that I think it really helped the downtown development was the revolving loan program that the city set up. In the few minutes we have left, Amanda, can you tell us what that is and how it works?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that because we've talked a lot about kind of major corporations and major retailers, but the city certainly has a focus on supporting our entrepreneurs. And the city's revolving loan programs have been present for 30 years or more. They are capitalized by community development block grant funding through the Housing and Urban Development Authority. So the federal funds, and the city has commercial loan programs which help businesses do a variety of things. It may help them acquire a building. We may provide a micro enterprise loan, which could be just $20,000 of a capital influx into a business.
But that could make the difference.
It could make a huge difference, and especially in some of those areas that you mentioned, such as downtown and Commercial Street. We have a long list of success stories, and really when we think about how to keep Springfield attractive, it's really those types of things that are unique and are the charm and character for Springfield. So the commercial loan programs and having a revolving fund, that's not something that every city has. And certainly every city doesn't have kind of 30 years of success for that. Many cities were setting those funds up utilizing CARES COVID-related relief funds or ARPA funding. So to have that established program has been a really excellent tool for the city of Springfield to support entrepreneurs. Everything from food trucks to retailers to restaurants that really just help us attract people. And
Ben, I'm going to give you the last word. Is there anything I failed to ask you about?
Well, please come talk to us. We've talked about big businesses, small businesses, entrepreneurs. We have very small staffs. Amanda, you've got what, two or three people? I've got 2 or 3 people. If you're considering an expansion, if you have a business question, give us a call. We'd love to talk to you. There are a lot of things that we know about that aren't necessarily direct related to the utility company or to the city, but we know a lot of folks. We interact with a lot of people, whether it's in education, workforce development, financing. Give us a call. We'd like to hear what you're facing. We'd like to hear about your challenges, and we'd like to help you grow. Our goal is to make Springfield a better place to live. And we both live in the area, and I'm one of those houses that's right on the city-county line. So I won't tell you which side, but these things matter, and we're doing everything we can to help make Springfield a great place to be. So give us a call. We're interested to hear what's going on, and we'd love to know how we can help.
Okay. I want to thank you both for being my guests today in our town.
thank
Very
you.
good. Thank you.
You're welcome. That's it for this week, and many thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to other episodes, you can visit the Springfield Daily Citizen website at sgfcitizen.org/innertown or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.